So today's lecture is going to be coding from scratch. We're going to go over JavaScript, the terminal, and source control. So let's go ahead and begin. So what is JavaScript? JavaScript is the programming language of the web. It is the only programming language understood by every modern web browser. JavaScript enables us to build the interactive websites we use daily. So JavaScript, in essence, is essentially the muscle of a website. It does all the interacting with the user, the data manipulation, and essentially what makes websites interactive these days. In order to connect a JavaScript file to your HTML file, you will be using a script tag. So if you have a project created here, if we have a project created here, you're going to, similar to like you do in CSS where you put a link tag in your head, we're going to put a script tag at the bottom of our body. So if you notice here, let's zoom in here. If we look, this is my closing body tag. Right above that, I'm going to put my script tag. And with JavaScript script tags, you have an opening and a closing tag. Inside of your opening tag, you're going to have the attribute source, src, and you're going to set it equal to the name of the file. Here, my file is script.js, so it's just following the path of the root directory. And the root directory is simply where your project folder. So if we look here, my project folder is CFS2 lecture, and in there I have index.html and script.js. So that is how you connect your JavaScript file to your HTML file. With JavaScript, there are variables. You can think of variables as containers. They hold a value, so we can use it throughout our website. When declaring a variable in JavaScript, we use the var keyword followed by the name of the variable. So if we look at the example here, we have var, which is saying, hey, this is a variable. And then we have the name of the variable. So in this case, the student name is the name of the variable. And then we set it equal to a value. I've set it equal to a string value of Ricardo. So that if I were to write that here, if I were to print out something, or console log, and if I were to console log student name, the console will print out Ricardo. So now student name is equal to Ricardo. And the same you can do with different data types. So you have numbers, so 2, 2.8, 2.8, things of that nature. You can also do Booleans, which are essentially true or false. So true or false, that would be a Boolean. And then we have strings, which we saw earlier, like Ricardo. We also have something called arrays, which is essentially a list of elements. And that could be a list of numbers, strings, Booleans, things of that nature. We'll go a little bit more into detail about arrays, but this is essentially how you declare any variable. And we can also declare empty versions of it. For example, like an empty string would just be 2 quotes together like that. And this is just saying this is a string, but there's nothing in that string. Same with an array, you would just have the open, closed, square brackets, and that's saying it's an empty array. Next, we're going to go ahead and discuss if statements. If statements are essentially your decision-making points. With an if statement, you're usually checking a condition. So if a condition is true, then you want to do something. So for example, if you wanted to buy a pair of shoes, let's say you're buying the latest cool sneakers, and they cost $200. If your wallet has over $200, then you can purchase the shoes. Now, if we were to write that in pseudocode, if we look at the breakdown structure here, we have the if keyword and then a pair of parentheses. So if we write that here, if, and then in the parentheses, inside of the parentheses, we're going to write what we're checking. So for the example of the sneakers, let's presume I have a variable, well, I'll just declare it. So I'm going to declare variable wallet. Now I'm going to set it equal to an initial value of $400. Okay. Then I'm going to write an if statement. So if wallet is greater or equal to 200, then, and just like in English language, if then, but instead of writing the word then, we write these curly brackets. And then inside of the curly brackets, you would write the code that you want to happen. So let's pretend there is a function called buy shoes that exists, and we'll go over what functions are. But if my wallet has more or equal to $200, then I can purchase the shoes because the shoes cost $200. And that's essentially the breakdown of an if statement. Now there's variations of if statements. You can have if else, if else, if else. So essentially, if else breaks down to if this condition is met, do this, else, or if you were speaking just a regular sentence, otherwise, do something else. So else, don't buy shoes. So if this condition is true, go ahead and do this, else do this. So this is kind of your fallback. If nothing matches any conditions that you're checking, then we're going to go ahead and do this instead. So another thing that you could do is have if else, if statements. And essentially that means that you're checking multiple conditions. So let's go ahead and write one out. So if wallet is greater than or equal to 400, we can buy 2 pairs of shoes, right? So I'm going to buy shoes twice. Okay. And then I'm going to check else if wallet is greater than equal 200, then I'm going to only buy shoes once. So here we're checking 2 conditions. Do I have $400 or more? I do. Okay, cool. That means I can buy 2 pairs of shoes. So I'm buying shoes twice. If I don't have $400 or more, so let's say you had $300 in your wallet, then is wallet have more than $200? Well, we have $300, so you can buy a pair of shoes. If it doesn't meet the conditions of having more than 200 or more than 400 or equivalent to, then you probably shouldn't buy a pair of shoes. And that's kind of the breakdown of if else statements. And that can be chopped up as in we could take this out, we could take this out, and you can add it as needed depending on what you need to check and what you need to do in your program. Are there any questions so far about variable declarations or if statements? All right, we'll go ahead and proceed. Next, we're going to go ahead and talk about arrays. Array is a data structure that we use to store values. You can think of them as a collection of values. And you can use an array to store multiple values. So you can think of it like a list. Like when you go to the grocery store, you make a shopping list of things you need, right? You need apples, you need meat, milk, eggs, all the different things that you could purchase. And in that list, you could wrap that around and make an array. So it's just a list of items. So if we look at the array here, say I wanted to make an array called shopping list. And in that array, I have a bunch of string elements. So inside, I'm going to have milk. We'll have eggs. Oops, no semicolon there. Eggs, pineapple, let's see, coffee. So there I have created an array of strings, just like I can create an array of numbers. So let's say I wanted to create an array of scores. Let's say we're playing Scrabble, and there's 4 players. So someone has a score of 175, someone has a score of 132, 198. So I have an array of numbers, and so on and so forth with the different data types. You can have different arrays. So let's say I have these 2 arrays and I wanted to add things to the shopping list, or I wanted to figure out how many items are in my shopping list. So there are different methods that you can use on arrays to figure these things out. But before we go into the methods, let's look at the breakdown of an array. So here we have the variable declaration, the name of the variable, and then we have our array. Our array has 1, 2, 3, 4 items. So if I were to run the .length method on shopping list, I would get the number 4. But the total number of indexes that shopping lists have is 3. Well, the last number is 3. There's a total of 4. And why that is because arrays start with the index 0. So milk is considered 0, eggs is considered 1, pineapple is considered 2, and coffee is considered 3. So if I were to get shopping list at index 2, I would get pineapple. Now, if I wanted to add an item to my shopping list, let's say, oh, I forgot to add lettuce. You would do shopping list dot push, and then inside the parentheses, you would put what you want to push. So I want to push, what did I just say? Lettuce. So now if I were to console log shopping list, I would get milk, eggs, pineapple, coffee, lettuce. Let's expand this a little bit more. Now, if I wanted to remove an item off the shopping list, you could do .pop. So similar to .push, you would put .pop and then open close parentheses because it's a function, and then that would remove the last item on the list. So then this would equal milk, eggs, pineapple, coffee. If I were to do shopping list.length, we would get the number 4 because there are 4 elements. So if, let's say you're at the end of the grocery store and you're ready to purchase and there is a 10 items or less lane that you want to go because all the other lines are full, you can write an if statement. If shopping list.length is less than or equal to 10, then I can go to lane 1. Else, I'm going to wait in line. Something like that. So that's incorporating all the things that we've learned so far. We're looking at variables, we're looking at different data types, arrays, different methods, and if statements. Are there any questions so far on what we've talked about? All right, we'll go ahead and keep going. Next, we're going to go ahead and talk about loops. There are many loops that you can use in JavaScript and in a lot of other programming languages, but the main one I want to look at is the for loop. It's kind of like the mother of all loops, in my opinion. You can always recreate a loop with a for loop. So if we look at the structure of a for loop, we have the keyword for, and then we have these parentheses. Inside of the parentheses, you have 3 segments. The first segment is declaring a index variable and setting it at some starting point. So as I discussed earlier, usually it starts at 0. So what you'll most commonly see is var I equals 0. And I could be anything. You could call it bananas for all I care. But I is usually represented to represent index. Then followed by a semicolon, you have your condition statement. And usually it is I less than some stopping point. So let's say if it was, I wanted to go through my whole shopping list, then I would put the length of the array here. Then followed by that, you have I++, and that's essentially incrementing the value of I by 1 every time this goes through. So every iteration, I gets added 1. So we start off at 0, it does some things, I is now 1, does some things, I is now 2, does some things, and so on and so forth. The reason why I is able to go to the next one is because of this code right here where it says I++. So if we were to make a loop with our shopping list, I would have for var I equals 0, I less than shopping list dot length, because length is my stopping point. I want it to stop at the last one. And then I++, and in there I want to purchase item. Let's pretend there's a function that exists called purchase item. So I am looping through here. Let's say we can pass on a parameter, and I'll touch back on this later once we discuss functions. But I am looping through the shopping list. My stopping point's at the end of the list, and we figure that out by dot length. And I am going to purchase every item on that shopping list. So first I grab the milk, purchase it, grab the eggs, purchase it, pineapple, coffee, so on and so forth. So that is essential breakdown of a for loop. Of course, within the for loop, you could have if statements and do a lot of nesting within that. But you can just, let's say you're looping through here, and if you're saying if item is greater than $15, then don't purchase item. Right? So those are different things that you can do. Of course, that code wasn't correct, so I don't have those variables declared, but you kind of get the idea and feel for it. Any questions on loops? All right. So next we're going to go ahead and talk about functions. So if you're looking at the code here, you see these yellow pieces of code that represent a function or a method. In order to create your own function, you would declare it similar to how you declare a variable. So you write the word function and then the name of the function. So let's say I wanted to create the purchase item function. And inside of these parentheses is where you're going to have your parameters. So if we look at the structure here, we have function, name of function, your parameters, and then some curly brackets, and then the code you want to execute inside of your function. So a parameter is essentially the information that you need to pass into the function in order to get it to work. So let's say item is my parameter. I'm going to call it item. I could have called it cup if I wanted to, but I'm going to call it item because that's what makes sense for the function. And then with that, I can do some things with it, right? So if I had, let's pretend we still had wallet, I update wallet to equal wallet minus item dot price. And now I'm getting a little bit technical, and that goes into objects, but let's just pretend for the sake of the example. Here, when I'm calling on the function purchase item, I'm passing some information. Shopping, maybe if I labeled it right, shopping list at I. So if we're looking at shopping list at I, the syntax right here, we're saying shopping list at index I. Depending on where we are in the for loop, let's pretend we're at the very beginning at 0. we're looking at shopping list at 0, which is milk, right? That's our 0 index. So when I'm calling this item, I'm passing on the milk, right? So now I'm updating my wallet to equal wallet minus the price of that item. And this syntax comes along once you start dealing with objects, but we'll discuss that later. So that's essentially functions there, and you can use them within for loops, if statements, wherever you need to use them. But this is essentially how you would create one. And usually functions, they can be small, they can be big. You want it to be so that you can reuse it in different situations, right? So the goal of coding is to kind of do some dry coding and write as less as possible. Now, when you're starting off, you're going to go the long route because that's what makes sense. But once you start tailoring and grooming your code, you find that reusability is where you want to go, and you'll create lots of functions to do things that you find yourself writing over and over and over again. So functions are a really great tool that you want to utilize in your code. Which then brings me to scope. Scope is the area in which your variables and functions can be accessed. There are 3 kinds of scope. You have global scope, function scope, and block scope. You want to be careful of your scope because there will be times where you are calling on a variable and you think you have access to it, but the scope is incorrect and you don't have access to it. So the output of your code may not be exactly what you're expecting. One thing to look for when you're debugging is the scope. So if we look at our code here, we see item. That's one scope we can look at. So this is function scope. If I were to write console log item out here, it would give me an error because item in this scope does not exist. Item only exists in the scope of the function. So it's only this information item is only accessible inside of this function. So that's function scope. Then we have global scope. So if we're looking at wallet, let's say I wanted to make it a valid variable, I would write it out here, right? So var wallet equals, let's say 600, right? So here, wallet is accessible inside of this function because it is declared on a global scope. It's visible to everything in this program. So it's visible to here if I were to write it in this if statement. It's visible to this for loop. It's visible to this function. It's visible everywhere. That's global scope. Then you have block scope. So let's say you have a chunk of code, right? And there is, let's play in this for loop. So let's say I had a variable called coupons. So I'm going to let coupons equal -20, right? $20 off. So here, this variable is only available in this scope of the block of code. So right here, and that's why we use the keyword let instead of var. So we're saying, hey, let coupons equal this until this block of code is over. So we're only using it temporarily, and sometimes you need temporary variables to do whatever you need to do, and you use the keyword let. So it's only available between these 2 curly brackets. It's not going to be available here, or here, or here. It's only within the scope of the block. Any questions on scope so far? All right. Next, we're going to go ahead and talk about the DOM, which is Document Object Model. It's basically a programming interface for your HTML documents. It provides a visual representation of the HTML elements you placed in your document. So right now, you should be in about week 2 or 3 in your coding from scratch, depending on what course you're in. But so you should be used to HTML. So we have an HTML file here. And let's say we have, let's This is a page, and let's say I have a text area right here. Oops, forgot my thing here. Right, and I'm writing some HTML. Oops. All right. So here I've written some HTML. It says this is a page, write something below. I have a text area and a button. So if we look here and if I open that here, it's over here, we have this. So I can write something and I can click this button. Right now it doesn't do anything because I haven't written anything in my JavaScript, right? So with my JavaScript, we have DOM manipulation. So here you're going to be using document dot something, right? And you can grab elements by their ID, by their tag name, by their class. There's different way that you can grab different elements. If we're looking at elements, we're looking at our HTML elements. So we're talking about H1, H3, text area, button. Those are the elements that we're referring to. So let's say that I wanted to grab whatever the user wrote inside of my text area, and I want to grab it by its ID. In order for me to do that, I have to write an ID inside of the opening tag. So I'm going to call this ID user input, right? So in order for me to grab that, I need to grab the document. So I'll do document, and then I'm going to do it by get element by ID. And then in parentheses, inside of quotes, I'll have the ID name. So I believe I called it user input. And that's going to grab the entire element. So this is going to grab the entire element, but I don't want to grab the entire element. I just want to grab whatever they wrote here, right? So let's pretend I want to grab the word bananas. So then I'm going to put dot value, and that's going to grab bananas. So if you're looking here, and one way to test your code out is you click inspect. I right-clicked, clicked inspect. Then I'm going to open my console. And here I'm going to say document dot, well, let me make sure I saved my changes here. Let's refresh this. So I'm going to say document dot get element by ID, and I'm going to say user input. And let's say I want to call this a variable. I'm going to call it input. I'm going to do that. So now input is a variable and it equals document.get element by ID user input. So if I write input, we see here that it is equal to that entire text area. So let's say I write bananas. And I want to do input.value. We see bananas. So that's how it's going to grab that. And it's communicating with the DOM in order to be interactive, right? So that is one thing that you can do. Another thing that you can do, let's say you wanted to put some text inside of the DOM, right? So let's say a user clicked on something and that button is supposed to output a bunch of things. So let's go for a school website, right? If you click on a course number and then it lists out the syllabus, for example. So you wanted to click a button and you want it to print out something. Well, first let's look at how to manipulate the change. So here I'm going to say this is some text. I'm going to save that. If we refresh this, we have some text here, right? So if we're just playing on here, we can do document get element by ID. This needs an ID. Hold on. I'm going to call it sample text. save that, refresh this because I made changes. Okay. And then what did I call my ID here? Sample text. All right. So if we do sample text, and I want to change what sample text says. So I'm going to do inner HTML. So .inner HTML is essentially whatever's in between the opening and closing tags. So inner.html is this is some text, right? But I want to change the value of that. I don't want it to say this is some text. I want it to say, whoa, I changed the text. And you see here, I have now changed the text. So those are some things that you can do with some DOM manipulation. Things to make things do when you click it is like an event listener. So let's pretend we have our button here, and I'm going to give it an ID of click. And here I'm going to create an event listener. So I'm going to have a variable called button. I'm going to set it equal to document get element by ID. And in there, I called it click. And then I have the entire element because this, I do want the entire element. I want to grab the entire button. Now I'm going to add an event listener to my button. I'm going to listen for a click. And when I do the click, I'm going to perform a function. Inside of that function, I'm just going to change the text like we just did. So I just moved, oh wait, that's not what I wrote. What was it here? Oops. We have sample text. So I'm going to change the sample text like we just did in the console. And that's all my function's going to do, right? Then I put my little semicolon at the end because all in all, this is just one big statement. So I'm going to save this, come back here, refresh it. I can close the console and click this. It changed. So that is how you can add an event listener. Another thing that you can do with button is on click, which is, let's say, on click equals my function name, and let's call it change text, right? So here in my JavaScript, instead of doing an event listener, I'm just going to have a function. I'm going to say function change text. And then I'm going to add this here. And it will do the same thing. So if we refresh, it did the same thing. So those are two different ways that you can add a click feature to your button. And that's how you can manipulate the DOM and talk to it. So I highly recommend doing a little bit more research on your end about the different ways that you can manipulate the DOM. It's something that is very useful and will make your website stand out from the rest. And then we have our Chrome inspector. Essentially, that's what I just showed you here is when I clicked inspect, we can go ahead and go to the console and write some JavaScript code in order to play around to see if what we're thinking is in fact what we want it to be. So before I wrote the code out here in my text editor, I checked it out on the console to make sure it is exactly what I want it to be. Next, we're going to go ahead, well, before we jump into the terminal, are there any questions on JavaScript? Functions, DOM manipulation, if statements, for loops? All right, we'll go ahead and keep going then. Next, we're going to go ahead and talk about the terminal. The terminal is an interface in which you can type and execute text-based commands. Normally, we're used to a GUI. So essentially what that means is this session is going to end in 10 minutes, but if you just re-click the link, it will open back up again, just full warning in case I cut out. But essentially, the GUI that we're used to is our desktop, for example. I right-click, I create a folder, it's automatically called something, I call it folder 1, and that's what we're used to, clicking, dragging, and things of that nature. Well, the terminal is kind of command-based, and it can do the same things. So if we're looking at the terminal, I have it open up here, and the way to open it up on a Mac is go to Utilities, and then click Terminal. In the curriculum, there's directions on how to open it in a Windows if you have Windows. But essentially that opens up to here, and there are some basic commands that you'll be using. So if we look at the table here, I'm going to be using these commands because I'm on a Mac, but we have ls, which lists the files in a current directory. We have cd, which changes directory, mv, which moves a file to a new location, CP copies a file, RM deletes a file, and then we have the Windows commands here. There's also a bunch of other commands that you'll be using. So for example, I'm going to list the things I have here, the list items, and I want to go into my desktop, so I'm going to change directories into my desktop, CD desktop. I am now in my desktop. And here I'm going to make a new folder. So I'm going to say make directory, let's call it lecture.js, right? So there I have made the directory. And if I list here, we have a whole list of items and we have the lecture right here. So now I'm going to change directory into lecture.js. Okay, if I wanted to create a file, I would just do touch file dot whatever extension it is. And then if I list the items there, you can see file dot text is right there. And then if I wanted to remove it, I would do rm file dot, oops. And if we check, we see it's not there. Right, so those are basic command line commands that you'll be using in order to be, creating directories and things of that nature. If you look at the file organization, you will hear people say root directory. That's mainly your main project folder. And then within that, you have your subdirectories, right? So let's say a folder inside a folder. Inside a folder, you'll have files here. You might have a folder within a folder within a folder, with files, with folder, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of see the family tree kind of go down. So that's essentially the basics of a terminal. Are there any questions on that so far before we jump into source control? All right, so let's go into source control. Source control is a tool that allows developers to manage file changes throughout the development process. It allows each developer to write and test code on their own computer without interfering with another developer's workflow. It allows developers to work simultaneously with teammates and go back in time, trace the source of the bugs. And it allows us to easily version our code. So essentially, you'll hear source control or version control, different things that refer to the same thing. But essentially, if you're working on a big project and you have like 5 teammates and each of you are working on a different feature, instead of changing the root file with each feature, you have your own branches. So Tom is working on this, Jill is working on that, and they're working on their own version of the code. So you have your root that everyone clones from and then gets that original copy of like a starter kit. And then you all write your own features in your own separate branches. Now, if Tom wrote something that doesn't work and breaks everything, if Tom were to put that on the main file, then everything would break, right? So we want Tom environment to be only Tom's environment. Same with Jill. And it's not until everything's tested and working fine that you want to merge everything together and make it one happy working file. So that's why you get version control, right? We have Tom's version, Jill's version, and so on and so forth. One of the greatest things is Git. It's very popular, and that's how the most common version of source control is. So what you'll want to do is create an account with GitHub. So you'll go to github.com. Is this out? You'll create an account, and then you'll see it here. So if we look at my profile, I already have an account. I'm signed in. We can see my repositories and things like that. So with that, you can download. So you can do it through the command line, which I suggest learning. But for beginners, it's best to use a GUI interface. So you want to download Git Kraken. And if you download it here, getkraken.com. You see it, you can download, and then they have it for multiple platforms. So if you're not Mac, of course, you can go to Windows. And then if we open it here, we see this is kind of what it looks like. So if I go here and I want to clone a repo, and let's say repo. So I'm going to create a new repository, and essentially a repository is a bundle of commits. So every time you change your code, you make a commit, and it kind of saves all of those, so you can save that. So let's say I'm saying lecture example, and I want it to be public, and then I'm going to initialize it with a README file. So I'm going to create my repository.